أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الحمد لله وبه نستعين والصلاة والسلام على السيد المرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thanks to Dr. Sayyid Qazi for inviting me and hosting me in Las Vegas, a fascinating place, especially for Muslims. Seems to be, I've heard of Muslims in Las Vegas, now I've seen them, and so far everyone's been extremely nice and hospitable. I'm looking forward to speaking more to you and learning more from you about life here. So the topic I want to speak about is about how Muslims overall, Muslims in the West, Muslims in the United States, Muslims in the modern world deal with the issue of their scripture, of the Quran and the Sunnah. Is this okay? Let's try doing this. Okay, how's that? Good? Okay, excellent. I don't mind just talking really loud, so it depends. I'm used to shouting in my classes. We have a room this big, and I talk just for an hour and a half in a loud voice. So it's up to you. It doesn't bother me. You don't have to turn it on if you don't want. Anyway, I'll leave you to determine this stuff, and I'll just keep talking, and if it sounds terrible, well, it's not my fault. So, first I would like to ask, this is an interesting question. How many of you remove your shoes when you walk into your house? Yeah. How many of you do not remove your shoes when you walk into your house? Okay. Those of you who do not remove your shoes when you walk into your house, why do you not remove your shoes when you walk into your house?
I don't have a carpet, so I can walk in with my shoes on.
Okay.
I don't walk on the carpet with shoes.
Okay. Other people?
Same reason.
Same reason. Okay. Interesting. I have a question. In general, in the United States, do people remove their shoes when they go into houses or not? No. Why don't they?
Not part of the culture.
Yeah, it's not part of the culture. It's actually a really stupid thing to do, to walk into your house with your shoes on. It's very silly. I mean, why would you walk outside in mud and dirt and all sorts of other things? And even if you don't consider, dog poop or anything like that to be particularly disgusting, which most people do just because it smells awful, but it also has religious significance for some people. Even if you don't consider these things to be particularly dirty and unhealthy, you're still increasing the costs of cleaning your carpets or even your floors, actually. So it doesn't, even if you don't have a carpet, you're still getting your floor dirty. And you have to wipe the floor or something, or somebody does it. So it's unnecessary. I find it interesting. And yet people not only wear their shoes inside, but may find it unusual and maybe a little bit off-putting to go into a house or a place where they have to remove their shoes. You can imagine people's, maybe some average Joe American being a little bit annoyed by the fact that he or she has to remove his or her shoes when they go into a house or something like that, or a mosque. And certainly this is something that is noted as being kind of exotic or unusual. But I think it's pretty clear that it's actually much more sensible. If we're just being reasonable, if we're not allowing our actions to be determined by anything but by a sort of very secular notion of reason, what's the most reasonable thing to do for our best interest, we would actually remove our shoes before we went into our house. Or we'd have a different set of shoes for inside and outside, kind of like Mr. Rogers. Does anyone know who Mr. Rogers is anymore? Okay, good. So another question. How many of you have seen or heard of people making comments about women who wear hijab, about the idea of hijab? What kind of things do you hear people say about that? What do you hear people say about it?
They ask if the women are oppressed, and that's why.
Okay. So the assumption is that wearing a hijab is some kind of oppression. I mean, but this is very interesting. Think about it. Why is covering your head any more oppressive than covering any other part of your body? I mean, is there some kind of line or something between your neck and your head? If you cross this line, somehow human beings should automatically feel like they're being suffocated, as if someone's actually cutting off their oxygen. I mean, it seems like kind of an arbitrary line to draw. So in America, women wear shirts. They don't walk around topless, correct? Well, we're in Las Vegas, but in general, out on the street, women do not walk around topless. And somehow this is the line. Your neck is the line. You can show everything you have to cover everything below really your neck, but above your neck, you shouldn't cover something. And if you are covering above your neck, then there's something wrong. Someone is forcing you. This is unnatural. This isn't the way things should be done. This isn't the way that modern free people act or dress. Do you think this is a fair description of assessment of the situation? I mean, this is a very, very interesting, because I don't see any, I read, let's say, The Economist, and The Economist is talking about how, in Egypt, it sort of talks approvingly about women who don't wear hijab and men who are wearing jeans or something like that, as if wearing jeans and not wearing hijab is morally better than wearing, let's say, a galabiya or wearing hijab. But in fact, there's no real moral weight to denim versus a cotton galabiya, or between covering your head or not. This is entirely based on custom. What one group of people sees as normal for them, and another group, and they see other ways of dressing as abnormal. One group of people thinks it's normal to walk into their homes with their shoes on. Another group of people considers that abnormal. In that case, I think there's a pretty good, reasonable favorite amongst those two choices. In the case of clothing, really, I don't see any way to favor one as opposed to the other. My point is that custom really informs most of what we do. When you think about why you act the way you do, why you dress the way you do, why you style your hair the way you do, most of it is because of custom. And this is something that I think a lot of times people in the United States, and I'd say in the West in general, and we could talk about other civilizations as well, but I'll focus on this one, they don't appreciate. Because their behavior is seen as, they see their behavior as rational, as modern, and modern is partially what's rational and reasonable and scientific. It's assumed that most of what people do is good, is reasonable, is what should be done, not just what has been done culturally. And we can go into many examples of this in American society or in British society. But what's very interesting is how infrequently people are willing to simply say, this is our custom, this is the way we do things, there's no reason for it, it's not any better or worse than anything else, it's simply the way we do things. And therefore, the way other people do things is exactly as valuable and has the exact same weight for them as our way of doing things has for us. People very rarely are willing to make that conclusion because, again, the assumption is that the way we do things is modern and good and reasonable, hence other ways of doing things is not modern or reasonable or good. This brings up, and when we talk about complicated issues, we often end up talking about the Greeks or using Greek words, and I think in this situation it's appropriate. The division that the ancient Greeks made between nomos, N-O-M-O-S, nomos, and phusos or physos, depending on how you read it, P-H-Y-S-I-S, physos. You may know where this word, we have words that come from this, words like physics. Right? So nomos is law, nomos is custom. This is what people decide for themselves. These are customs and conventions, things that human beings create as values and rules amongst themselves. Physos is reality, natural reality. And when we talk about religion, or when we talk about sort of right and wrong in the absolute sense, what we're saying is that there is a notion of right and a notion of wrong. Rules that exists separate from human beings. That even if human beings got together and decided, let's say, that murder is right, murder would still be wrong. So Physos is the idea that there is something out there separate from us that's real, that exists apart from us, and that will always be the case. Absolute right and wrong. Like the rules of nature. Okay? Nomos says, these are the things that we as a group of people, whether we're 10 people or 20 people or 100 people or 1,000 people, a city or a whole country, these are the things that we have gotten together and agreed upon, either through just consensus or through active agreement. These are our rules. Now, what we see very often in human history is that people assume that their nomos is actually physos. They think that their custom is actually some absolute rule that makes so much sense, that seems so compelling to them, that it's inconceivable to them that all human beings would not find this also to be their law. Is this clear? Okay. And sometimes I think maybe Greek authors were lucky just because they were so early, 500 BC, 600 BC. They get to come up with really good observations before anyone else did, or at least early on in human memory. It's like being the first you're having a meeting and you get the good point in first, and everyone else has the same idea, but you get to say it first and seem really smart. This is the Greek poet Pindar in the 5th century BC. He has a great line of poetry where he says, "Custom is the king of all. Custom is the king of all." That's a very important point. When we think about how important our notion of convention and custom, our culture is to what we think is right and wrong, and that we most often, assume that this right and wrong is actually an absolute. Interestingly, Muslims also came to this realization. And just to give you an example, the great Muslim theologian Abu Hasan al-Ash'ari, who died in 935 of the Common Era, from the city of Basra, he and his school of thought, which became dominant in Islam, was that there is no such thing as absolute right and absolute wrong. Human beings, we can't sit and come up with some rules for absolute right and absolute wrong. Our reason can't create that. Right and wrong are determined by God. Right and wrong are determined by God. There's no notion of right or notion of wrong that exists separate from God. God makes things right and wrong by doing things or by forbidding things, by commanding things or prohibiting things. Now, why would Abu Hasan al-Ash'ari come up with this? This seems kind of, imagine you're going up to somebody at a dinner party and you say, there's no such thing as right and wrong. And they say, how can you say that? That's so messed up. How can you say that? Are you saying that, are you saying it's okay to go out and just beat up someone in the street? Or are you saying it's okay to go and the things like committing rape and all these things? Are you saying these are right? Or these aren't wrong? There's just no such thing as right and wrong? Why would someone come up with this conclusion? Well, in this case, it's very interesting that the fact that Muslims by the 900s of the Common Era were spread all the way from Spain to India. And they could see on their travels, Muslim scholars could see how different local customs were. And this is actually in a movie with Antonio Banderas called The 13th Warrior. I don't know if anyone has seen this movie. It's one of the few movies with a Muslim hero. No one's seen The 13th Warrior? Okay, you should go see it. It has a Muslim hero and there are no sex scenes, so it's worth seeing if you're Muslim. Anyway, there's things in this movie and you think this is just Hollywood. Actually, it's based on, part of the movie is based on the memoirs of a Muslim traveler who was the ambassador from the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad he was supposed to go to meet basically the Tatars on the Volga River in southern Russia. And he didn't actually arrive there. He had to turn back because of weather. But on his way, he met Vikings who were, by that time, coming down from Scandinavia through the river systems of Russia into what's now Ukraine and the Caspian Sea area. In fact, that's where we get the name Russia from the Rus, who were a Viking group who settled down there. And he describes something very interesting. He goes to a Viking funeral of a chief who's died. And they take the chief's body and they put it in a boat, a long boat, and they take it out on a river. And they get one of his slave women, and they take her into a tent with the body, 6 warriors, and the warriors all have relations with her, and while they're stabbing her, and then they strangle her to death and leave. And then they set the boat on fire, and that's it. The funeral is over. And the Muslim ambassador, since he's from Baghdad, he's a very polite person, he's shocked. He is shocked by what he sees. And he inquires from the Vikings how they could do this to this chief. How could they have burials like this? And they actually ask him, they say, actually, we don't understand why you would take a body of a loved one and put it in the ground and let worms eat it. They thought that was more barbaric than what they were doing. So you can imagine if you are a Muslim scholar and you were dealing with populations living in Central Asia and Arabia and Yemen and North Africa, you see very clearly the local custom that there's no such thing as absolute right and absolute wrong. There's nothing that humans agree on, in effect. In effect. So where does truth come from? Where does right and wrong come from? Right and wrong comes from God. Right and wrong comes from revelation. From a source that defines truth for us. Now, that presents another challenge for Muslims. How do you deal with revelation? So for Muslims, the revelation is the Quran, the Word of God, revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, and the Sunnah of the Prophet, the teachings of the Prophet, the precedent of the Prophet. However we understand the Sunnah, whether it's through hadiths or through consensus or through living traditions like prayer. Very few people learn how to pray by reading hadiths. Most of the time they learn to pray by watching their parents or going to the mosque and seeing other people pray. And this we can take all the way back to the time of the Prophet. So, if we've decided that people are really governed by custom, and that they can think that their custom is so true that everybody else in the world must understand that this is the right way to live, we can say that. And then we can add to that our realization based on the Viking funeral incident that in fact, that's not the case. That in fact, people can be extremely attached and believe that something is completely correct and have another person believe that that thing is absolutely repulsive beyond belief. And these two groups can view each other's customs in exactly the same way. Now, we can then say, thank God that God has sent down revelation that gives human beings rules that they all have to follow if they believe in God and they believe in the Prophet. They have a source of truth that is transcendent, that comes from above. But still hasn't answered the question of how we understand these two sources of revelation. How do we derive laws from them? The Quran doesn't have laws for every single thing. Here's the section about how you wake up in the morning. Here's a section about how you get dressed. Here's a section about how you dry your hair. That's not in the Quran. The Sunnah of the Prophet has many details, but still has to be read and interpreted. You have many hadiths that seem to contradict each other, or a hadith that's general and another hadith that's specific, or a hadith that's said earlier in the Prophet's career and then he changes the ruling later on. A hadith that adjusts something in the Quran, or a hadith that changes a Quranic ruling. There's all sorts of instances. So, when Muslim scholars looked at the sources of revelation, they dealt with two issues. One, reliability, and two, interpretation and ambiguity. Now, when we talk about reliability with the Quran, the Quran is historically certain. Okay? The Quran is massively transmitted to the point that there's no reason for anybody to doubt the authenticity of any verse. And just in case, and you probably don't know this because you don't read obscure Islamic studies journals, but there was a page from a mushaf. It was found in Yemen in 1979. And underneath the writing is a page of an earlier mushaf from the time of Uthman ibn Affan, the time of the Caliph Uthman. It's been carbon dated, and there's high percentage chance that it comes actually from around 650, when the Quran as we know it was compiled by Uthman. This page is a pre-Uthmanic Quran page. This comes from before the Uthmanic Mus'haf. Now, scholars have now uncovered the writing underneath it using ultraviolet light. And guess what? It's really no different than the Uthmanic Mus'haf. The difference between it and the Uthmanic Mus'haf is no different than the difference between the different 7 readings of the Quran that are accepted as canonical by all Muslims. So just another piece of evidence that really, when you're talking about the Quran, there's no reason, whether you're Muslim or non-Muslim, to question the intactness of this document. You might not believe it's revelation, but it comes from the time of the Prophet, and there's no other Quran. There's no other version of the Quran. It was earlier, and someone hid it, and there's a big conspiracy to have some non-original version of the Quran. Now, the Quran is still subject to interpretation, and there are many verses of the Quran that are not clear in what they mean legally. So we still have the challenge of interpretation. We'll leave that for a second and talk about hadiths. Hadiths are units that tell us what the sunnah is of the Prophet. Kind of little units that get, if you put them together in the proper way, you get a representation of the sunnah, the Prophet's precedent overall. Unlike the Quran, the hadiths have not been recorded reliably from the time of the Prophet. This is not earth-shattering information for any of you. The first people to realize that hadiths were being made up were Muslims in the generation after the death of the Prophet, when they started seeing people making things up about the Prophet. And they had to come up with some kind of science for trying to sort out reliable hadiths from unreliable ones. And like the Quran, with hadiths, you also have the challenge of interpretation. So with the Quran, you just have to deal with how do you interpret it. With hadiths, you have to deal with figuring out, is this something the Prophet really said? And then you have to figure out how to interpret it. You have to figure out how different hadiths fit together with one another, and you have to figure out how they fit together with the Quran. With the Quran, you have to figure out how the different verses fit together, and you have to figure out how they fit together with the hadith. So this is the great challenge that Muslim scholars have faced. Now, getting back to the issue of custom, right and wrong, plausible and implausible. Because custom doesn't just tell us what is right and wrong, it also tells us what's possible or impossible for us. If you're living in tropical India, in the year 1500, and someone comes and tells you, I just saw something really interesting. Did you know that water, when it gets to a certain temperature, becomes hard, and you can ski on it and skate on it, build houses out of it? Did you know that? And the person says, that's absolutely ridiculous. I can't, this is insane. This is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard of in my life. That person goes a few hundred miles to the north or the south, and they may, or climbs a high mountain, they may in fact see water that's become hard. Someone comes and says, did you know that human beings are able to go to the moon and come back? They actually go and walk around on the moon. Someone 100 years ago or 200 years ago would say, that's ridiculous. That's impossible. But now it's quite possible. So notions of what's possible and impossible, plausible and implausible, are also determined by our own specific conventions, our own understanding of the world. So this presents a great challenge when we're trying to authenticate hadiths. We've decided that many of the things we hear attributed to the Prophet may be unreliable. They may be made up. The problem is, how do we know which ones are authentic and which ones aren't? if someone comes and tells you, I saw a herd of elephants flying around in the air in downtown Las Vegas, you probably would not believe them, right? Because elephants don't fly. And there are no elephants in Las Vegas, as far as I know, except there is all these circuses. Now, what if someone comes and tells you that, I read in this book that an author published 10 years ago, the author predicted everything that's going to happen in the next 10 years, and everything has been right. They predicted that there's going to be a man named Barack Obama, and he's going to win the presidential election in 2008, et cetera, et cetera. Would you believe this person? I'm just wondering. No, you wouldn't. Because guess what? People don't know the future, unfortunately. Otherwise, I'd make a lot more money. When you're talking about the Prophet, ﷺ, you don't have this luxury anymore. Because the Prophet can get knowledge directly from God. If somebody comes and tells you that you should go and slaughter everybody in your family, you should go and kill your children, would you follow them? No, probably not. What if God told you to do that? Like God told Abraham to slaughter his child. What do you do then? You obey God, right? Because God is your creator. And if he tells you to do something, you do it. Now you have hadiths. And the Prophet is God's messenger. And the Prophet tells you something. And there's a report that says something about what's right and what's wrong. And it seems odd to you. What do? This is a big problem, because normally if some person comes up to you on the street and tells you to do something that you don't find really convincing, you just tell them, sorry, I'm not going to follow you. Or you don't believe a story they tell you. What happens if it's the Prophet of God telling you? He knows better than you. So now you have a problem. How do you determine what can be attributed to the Prophet authentically and what isn't, when two of the methods we use to decide if stories are reliable or unreliable, things like anachronism, things like impossibility, things like things being morally unusual to us, these don't apply anymore. Because the Prophet knows more than you on all these accounts. So Sunni Muslims and Shiite Muslims actually came up with methods of looking at the transmitters and the chains of transmission for these reports to see, can we accurately trace this back to the Prophet? They tried to take their reason, their brains out of the equation, because reason, your minds, aren't able to judge a greater mind, a greater source of truth. But don't worry, I'm not going to talk to you about isnads. You won't be bored with this topic. Instead, what I'm going to talk about is, what do Muslim scholars do when they come across hadiths that seem unusual to them? First, someone actually asked a really interesting question, which I wanted to comment on, which is, basically, can people function without revelation? Yes, human beings can function fine without revelation. If you could have a community that there's lots of human communities the Quran speaks about that are ala fatratin min rusulin, right? That are they live in a time between prophets, when the message of one prophet has basically disappeared and no other prophet has come. So they live, or they live at the tail end of one prophet's message. They have no clear revealed law anymore. And those people can live fine. They just live based on custom, which is a perfectly acceptable way for human beings to organize their lives. The problem is when you say that custom is absolute right, and knows right absolutely and wrong absolutely, and that custom is so correct and so true, in fact, that other people also have to follow that custom. That's when that custom becomes overweening in its claims to truth. Now, Islamic law, the Sharia tradition, recognizes the importance of custom. So in the Sharia tradition, I'll talk in a second about how the issue I was talking about earlier of interpretation and authentication. But, for example, in Islamic law, you have principles like, let's say, marriage is, when a man and a woman agree on a certain, to become a man and wife, and the man gives the woman some mahr, and the woman becomes the man's wife. This is basically kind of and there's some kind of witnessing or recognition by the society. This is basically the skeleton of nikah. Now, how much that mahr is determined by custom. When the mahr is paid is determined by custom. You can pay the mahr, you have to pay it to the woman before you get married, or you can say, I'll pay you some of it now and some of it later, or you can say, I'll pay all of it later, or you can say, it's going to be this tiny amount of money, or it has to be a big amount of money. This is all based on custom. Right? What makes someone, if someone wants to be a witness to the marriage, what makes them a reliable witness? Reliability is based on custom. Right? Notions like muru'ah, which is virtue, someone's virtuous character, even in Islamic law it's defined as التخلق بخلق الأمثال في المكان والزمان, which is acting with the ethics of other people like you in your particular time and place. So if you have akhlaq in, let's say, India is different than akhlaq in Egypt, which is different from akhlaq in Turkey, which is different from akhlaq in Britain. If in some parts of the Muslim world, if you eat in the market, or if you walk around with your head uncovered, even if you're a man, this is very rude. Other parts of the Muslim world, they don't care if you eat in the market or if you walk around with your head uncovered. So this Islamic law actually this is just one example of custom, the importance of custom. In 3 of the 4 Sunni schools of law, people who are buying and selling things, they can cancel or annul a transaction until they've parted company. So let's say I buy something from you. Until we part company, I can say, no, actually I changed my mind, I don't want to buy this. Or you can say, I changed my mind, I don't want to sell this to you. Until we part company, then the deal is final. Unless there's some kind of agreement of a guarantee or something like that, or conditions. But what does parting company mean? Does it mean, what if, I walk into your shop and then I leave your shop? Is that parting company? What happens if we're in a market and I walk around the market and even though I leave your stall, I'm still in the market? Or is it the end of the day? These are all determined by custom. So Islamic law isn't about taking some really strict notion of revelation, just going and stamping it on all these different places. There's certain rules and principles, broad rules, general principles, that then get implemented according to the particular time and place and the customs of the people involved and the communities involved. So, going back to the question of interpretation, I talked a little bit about how Muslim scholars tried to authenticate hadiths. But let's assume that we've taken a bunch of hadiths and we've authenticated them. We've decided that we think they come from the Prophet. How do we treat these hadiths? How do we treat them? And here there's a very important principle which comes from several companions. Ibn Mas'ud, Ali ibn Abi Talib, made this statement, and others, where they said, if you are told a hadith, someone tells you a hadith, فَظَنُّ بِهِ مَا هُوَ أَهْدَى وَمَا هُوَ أَتْقَى وَمَا هُوَ أَهْيَى. Right? If you are told a hadith from the Prophet, think of it, interpret it in a way that is the best guidance, in the way that is the most pious, in the way that is the most befitting Prophet. There's a very, very important principle. Very, very important principle. And it's in fact the principle on which Islamic science of deriving laws and values, theological principles, everything, beliefs, from the Quran and Sunnah of the Prophet. The Quran is a book that consists of verses, individual sentences and clauses and paragraphs and chapters, units that are put together in a whole. The Sunnah of the Prophet is similarly, if you think about it being represented by collections of hadith, which isn't the only way we can think about the Sunnah of the Prophet, but is an important way, then it's also individual statements, things about that the Prophet said, things that the Prophet did, observations of his character, observations of his actions. Individual units. And what Muslim scholars did over centuries, and beginning immediately after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, was to look at this message as a whole, the teachings of Islam, and derive principles from it, important principles. Some of them are explicitly stated, like لا تزر وازرة وزر أخرى. No bearer of burdens bears the burdens of another. Somebody cannot be punished for something that somebody else did. An important principle. Other times, they derive these principles from looking at a collection of hadiths, looking at the Prophet's life overall. So they decided by the 1100s of the Common Era, they had a principle called al-Tahara al-Adami, or al-Tahara al-Adamiyya, which is human purity. Namely, that a human body, human beings are pure. They're not filthy. Like if a human being's saliva or a human being's tears can never be najis, can never be impure. Like if you shake someone's hand, their body isn't impure. It doesn't cause you to lose your wudu. Even if they're an unbeliever, even if they're idol worshiper, it doesn't matter. How did they decide this? Because looking at the Prophet's life, they saw him interacting with his relatives like Abu Talib, interacting with his enemies when they came on delegations, interacting with Christian delegations from Ethiopia, interacting with Christian delegations from Najran, and allowing them to go into the mosque and to do their prayers, and not having the mosque cleaned or anything like that. He's always interacting with people, and they didn't see him treating his touching or kissing or anything like that of someone who was not Muslim as somehow dirtying him. Now, these principles then, things like no bearer of burdens can bear the burdens of another, things like human purity, they then use these principles to read and understand the little units, these isolated units of the Quran, of Quranic verses, of Quranic laws, of hadiths. And they read these verses and hadiths in light of these principles. So, that quote from Ali ibn Abi Talib and Ibn Mas'ud, that if you hear a hadith from the Prophet, think of it what is closest to guidance, what is most pious, and what is most befitting the Prophet, means you're interpreting it in light of these principles. Just to give you an example, relating directly to this question of human purity, the Quran says, إِنَّمَا الْمُشْرِكُونَ نَجَسٌ. Mushriks, polytheists, are but impure. They're najas. This seems really clear. And then it says, and this will be there, and after this year, do not let them enter the sacred mosque again. That's the verse of the Quran. This seems very clear to me. I mean, you read this and it seems to say, polytheists are najas. Like, for example, pigs are najas, or dog saliva is najas. It seems to be very clear. Okay, so I know what I have to do now. The ruling has been clear. As I said before, this is not how Muslim scholars understood this verse, because they knew from their understanding of the Prophet's Sunnah, from the Quran overall, that this could not be interpreted literally, because literally its meaning was contradicted by the Prophet's overall Sunnah. So they said, if it's not interpreted literally, it must be figurative. So maybe it's speaking about that their beliefs, the beliefs of polytheists, are impure. Their beliefs are filthy. Another thing, the truth of the Quran and the Sunnah gives Muslim scholars principles that they then use when they're interpreting and reading those sources, the Quran and the Sunnah, the Quran and the Hadiths. But these aren't the only source of truth. I spoke earlier about truth coming from revelation and not from custom. That's true. But moral, ethical truth? What about empirical truth? So, if I say the sky is above us and the earth is below us, everybody's going to agree on that. Every single person in the whole world is going to agree on that. This is empirically true. If I say that, the moon, the sun goes around the earth, and from the time when it disappears from sight to coming back, it's 24 hours. It's empirically true. Okay? What do I do then when I have a hadith or a Quranic verse that seems to contradict scientific, for lack of a better word, scientific truth? And we tend to think that this is something that people in the modern world, they start figuring out how to do astronomy and physics and math, and then suddenly they realize that religion is false because religion's been telling them something unscientific for all these millennia, and now they've suddenly woken up and smelled the coffee, and they have to get rid of religion. This is a very poor reading of history, both Christian history and Islamic history. So, there's a hadith of the Prophet in the Sunan of Abu Dawood, which says that Shahra Eid la yanqusan Ramadan wa Dhul Hijjah. There's 2 months of festival that are never short, that never fall short. Ramadan and Dhul Hijjah. Now, how long is a Hijri month? Who can tell me? 30 days? Is it always 30 days? 29 or 30 days. So a month that's tam is 30 days, and a month that's naqis is 29 days. When you read this hadith, Shahra Eid la yanqusan Ramadan wa Dhul Hijjah, it seems to say that there's going to be 2 months of celebration that are never going to be 29 days, or always be 30 days. Unfortunately, this is completely not true, because we've all been through Ramadans, it's only 29 days. And if you say, no, it means they're both not true in the same year, that's also not true. Sometimes you have 29 days of Ramadan, 29 days of Dhul Hijjah. So, you could say this hadith is made up, or the Prophet really said it, but he must not have really been a prophet because it's not scientifically true. Or you can do what Muslim scholars did when they read this hadith, which is to say, it's obviously not literal. It must be talking about something else, which is, let's say, that these 2 months will always be complete in the barakah you get from them. Even if it's 29 days, you'll still have the barakah and the reward for your fasting or for your religious acts done in that month, as if it were a full month, which is how Muslim scholars understood the hadith. Right? Sometimes, all right, so just to review, the moral, ethical, legal teachings or messages of specific verses of the Quran and hadiths are read through the lens of the principles, the overarching principles that the Quran and the Sunnah teach us. The Quran and the Sunnah are also read against the other ayat that God has given us, which are the ayat al-kawn, the signs of the physical world. You read these two together. So, if you believe that the sun goes around the earth, because if you look and you sit up and you lie down and you spend 24 hours looking up at the sky, what are you going to see? You're going to see the sun and the moon going around the earth. Seems pretty reasonable. So when the Quran says the sun and the moon, kullun yajri ila ajalin musamma, each one of them seems to run on its own path. That makes total sense. They look like they're going around like this. And all that I can see, even if it's a clear sky, I sit around, lie down enough, I can see even the planets going around the earth, Venus and Mars and everything else. The stars rotating around like this. Everything's rotating around the earth. Let's say then you build some telescope or you have enough astronomical observation that you decide, actually, that's not true. Everything in the solar system is going around the sun. Oh no, now my religion has been destroyed. The holy book has been proven false. Is that what you do? Or you simply say, this verse must not be understood in that way. I've chosen to understand it in a certain way because I believed that the physical world worked in one way. I've now found empirical evidence that it works in another way, so I'll simply interpret the verse differently. Maybe it means that the sun and the moon each survive a certain they will exist for a certain amount of time, or that the sun will exist for a certain amount of time and then it will die out or become a supernova or whatever happens to stars when they reach the end of their lives. There's any number of ways we can interpret these things. What's the big crisis that's behind my topic? What is the big crisis? Why are we even speaking about this? We've spoken about custom. We've spoken about how we interpret Scripture. Because Muslims, since they encountered the force of modernity, since they encountered countries that appeared suddenly from the seas, from across the seas, with military power, with political organization, with social organization, with a command of science and knowledge that simply overwhelmed completely anybody else. Since Muslims came across this civilization, they haven't known what to do about their religion because they believed that they had the truth. They believed that truth was encapsulated in the Quran and the Sunnah, in the revelation of the Prophet. But now they find other people who don't believe in that. In fact, they make fun of that religion, and yet they're the most powerful ones. They're the ones who control knowledge. They're the ones who control almost the forces of nature. Their social organization, their values seem so attractive, so true. You want to dress like them. You want to act like them. You want to have your facial hair like them. You want to have your hair like them. You want to be like them because they're powerful, because they're advanced. And now you look at your holy book, you look at the things attributed to your prophet, and you sometimes think that they look silly. You sometimes think that they sound ridiculous, or that they teach things that are backwards, that don't go along with the nomos, the custom of this new world, a custom which must be true because it's the custom of those people who control everything now. And that's the big crisis, right? So when you hear certain hadiths or you read certain verses of the Quran, you think that you can't accept this anymore because it goes against the values of those societies. We have to remember two things. One, where do you get truth from? This is something I really think Muslims should ask themselves. Where do you get truth from? What is true for you, ultimately? Really, what is the truth for you? Is the truth God? Is the truth the message that God sent to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ? Or is the truth the ways of the society in which you live? Is nomos really, like Pindar says, is custom really the king of all? Is custom really your king? This is something Muslims, I ask myself this, I think we should all ask ourselves this question. What ultimately is the source of truth for you? What ultimately is a source of morals for you? You can feel, and just as something, I was speaking to some other gentleman about yesterday, someone can come and tell you that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ married a 9-year-old girl, and you can think that this is the worst thing you've ever heard. It can strike you like you've seen something so wrong happen that you're just disgusted inside. You can feel that way, and guess what? That doesn't mean anything. Because remember the example of the Viking funeral and the Muslim ambassador. He was repulsed by what they did in their funeral customs. They were repulsed by Muslim funeral customs. Repulsion, revulsion, feelings that things are deeply wrong doesn't mean anything morally. It doesn't mean anything in terms of truth. The fact of the matter is that feeling that you have doesn't mean that what the Prophet Muhammad did was wrong. It doesn't mean anything because other people in the world don't have that feeling at all. Other people in this society don't have that feeling. So we have to be very careful not to interpret this, even the deepest, most guttural revulsion as somehow being the truest reaction or the truest evaluation of something's moral character or moral nature. This is very important. And I ask you again, where do you get truth? Because if you believe that truth is embodied in revelation, and if you believe that Muslims The Quran is historically reliable, even if you're not Muslim. I think this is the conclusion you'd come to. If you want to talk about hadiths, we can sit and discuss till we're blue in the face whether or not hadiths are authentic or not. We can sit and have a long discussion about this. But I would tell you that our criterion, our measure for seeing if they are reliable or not, is not our reaction as modern Americans. It's not the feelings we have as people living in 21st century Las Vegas and whether we think something is right or wrong, because that has no moral worth. That does not have any weight for other societies, doesn't have any weight for other times and other places in history. And it certainly has no claim to some absolute truth, and has no power, has no right to overrule or to judge something that's attributed to the prophet of God. It's a very important principle. And it's not me giving some fire and brimstone lecture or saying that you have to do something because you're Muslim. Because you might have this reaction, and another person in another country who's not Muslim may find what this hadith says to be completely normal. So why is your reaction about this hadith being ridiculous and unacceptable? Why is your reaction any better than this other person's? And just to give you an example, as I said before, where do you get truth? If you believe that truth is in Revelation, and you are at least willing to consider that the hadiths that Muslim scholars have sorted through and analyzed at length to decide if they're reliable, if you at least were willing to give them that benefit of the doubt, why not follow the rule that Muslim scholars followed? If you hear a hadith, think of it, what is most pious, what is closest to guidance, what is most fitting of the Prophet. You may find wisdom. And this is something that, I think it's a very interesting case. You've all heard this hadith, it's in Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, of خُلِقَتْ الْمَرْأَةُ مِنْ ضِلْعٍ لَا تَسْتَقِيمُ عَلَى طَرِيقٍ لَا تَسْتَقِيمُ لَكَ عَلَى طَرِيقٍ. Okay? Women, and then there's different versions of the hadith after that, and I'll give you one version. Women are created from a rib, like a bent rib. Rib is crooked. And they will never straighten out for you. Speaking to a man, leka, they will never straighten out for you. If you enjoy them, if you want to enjoy them as they are crooked. If you try to straighten them out, you break them. Now, when I first read this hadith, I thought, this is just very sexist. This is obviously made up, Arabs are sexist, and, Muslims are sexist, and everyone in the past is sexist, and so this came out of Arab Muslim people in the past who were sexist, and they made this up because they wanted a way to oppress women. That's what I thought. And I thought, this is really, I don't want to have to go and defend this hadith, and people are going to come and tell me, how can Muslims believe this? And I'm willing to bet I'm not the only person who had this reaction. I'm willing to bet that I'm not the only person in this room who had that reaction. And then one day I was watching just some comedian on Comedy Central or something, or an HBO special. And the comedian, as is the want of comedians pretty much everywhere and all the time, got into his little, men understand things this way and women understand things that way. And I thought, it's funny how this seems to be part of every comedy routine, is that the comedian will say, men, they think about money like this. Women, they think about money like that. And of course, anytime a bunch of guys get together, I guarantee you, they will sit and talk about the nature of marriage and how women are and how they deal with women. And I don't know, because I'm not a woman and I've never been able to sneak into any of these gatherings, but I assume that this may be the case as well with women. They sit around and talk about why are men like this, why are men like that. And there is a whole industry of books, very successful books, not only commercially, but also I think useful for people's lives, that tell men how to be better husbands by not always thinking like men, but instead seeing the world as women do. So men, and I'm not revealing any trade secrets here as a man, but men generally consider women to be irrational. They consider their brains to be not straight. And sometimes they do really stupid things, and they want really stupid things. This is, by the way, I have no trouble going to court and saying that I believe the majority of men think this. What is this hadith saying? It's saying women, men, from your perspective, men, women are crooked. You can sit around and try and straighten them out. You can sit and tell them, why aren't you more like me? Why don't you see the world the way I do? Or you can accept that that's the way they are, that they're different from men, and accommodate them and try and enjoy life with them in that way. Which is, as far as I can tell from these men are from Mars, women are from Venus books, as far as I can tell from reading these books, that's exactly what those books are always telling you, which is don't sit around and try and change your spouse or expect her to act like a man, and women don't expect your husband to act like a woman. Instead, you have to understand how these two genders generally view the world differently, and seeing that difference, accommodate it, and this enables you to live a happier, more peaceful, and more productive life. So suddenly I realized here I had been judging this hadith all the time, and in fact, it had been making a point not only that comedians make tons of money off constantly, practically their bread and butter, but also that the most respected relationship self-help books also teach you. Now, I'm not trying to say that this is a mu'jiza and we should believe in Islam because the Prophet predicted what men are from Mars, women are from Venus was going to say some 1400 years later. That's not what I'm arguing. What I'm simply arguing is, look how, in my own life, I look at how my reaction changed to this hadith. At first, I completely rejected it. And then later on, I saw that my rejection was simply based on an inflexible reading of the hadith, based on my own prejudices as a modern Western man who comes from a background of not being Muslim. Or maybe the background of a modern Western Muslim who's so overwhelmed, so intoxicated by the dominance of this nomos, of this culture, that I read everything in the past according to it, and that I allow its prejudices to rule me. So I'll leave you with the question, where do you get truth? And if you get it, if you claim to get it from Revelation, why are we, why are you, why am I, not more willing to follow that rule of Muslim scholars in the past and interpret that revelation in the way that is most pious, closest to guidance, and most befitting of the Prophet? Thank you. I'll answer any questions you have, if I can.
Yes. Yeah, very nice lecture. Thank you very much.
Thanks. I'm glad you liked it.
Taking the time.
Did I stick to the time?
I said taking the time.
Oh, okay. I'm always very conscious of going overboard. I saw some people looking at the clock, so.
So one question I have is you talked about tradition and customs and how we think about things being right and wrong when we are in a certain time era. How much of hadith and sunnah do you think is also based on the tradition and customs based in that era?
Some of it is certainly based on the customs of the Prophet. When it talks about the Prophet talking about buying dates and selling date palms, or people buying a camel and the camel that will be given birth to by that camel and the next generation of camels that will be given birth to by that camel, this is not applicable to the United States today because camels and dates are not traded regularly. Right? When it talks about things like vihar, the Quran talks about things like vihar, which is a man divorcing his wife, repudiating his wife by saying, "You're like my mother to me." Again, I've never heard of this happening. This seems to be very specific to the life of the Prophet, to the time of the Prophet. Now, when you have instances like this, what Muslim scholars did is simply interpret the principle behind it and say that let's say, prohibition on buying the descendants of animals is based on a prohibition on what's called gharar, or unnecessary risk, excessive risk. You can't buy something that doesn't exist. You can't engage in future speculation. So they derive from that hadith and other hadiths, similar hadiths, rules and also exceptions to that rule. Now, what I sense is behind your question is, well, what about things like dress? Okay, so is the Quranic rules about dress, or the Hadith rules about dress, that women should wear, should only in public should only show their face and their hands and their feet? Is this simply Arabian custom, and are we then beholden to Arabian custom, or is there some value behind that that's really the thing we should be following? And this is the interpretation that some modern Muslim scholars have come up with, and some Muslim intellectuals have come up with, which is that it's really not the specifics of the hijab that govern or that should be the rules of dress for women, but rather simply a notion of modesty. Okay, I mean, let's entertain that for a second. I would again ask, now I don't wear the hijab. I'm not a woman. It would be very difficult to wear hijab. I do not know, if I were a woman, I do not know if I would have the chops to do it. I hope I would have the courage. My wife does. I have tremendous respect for her every day. Now, I ask you, what causes a difference there? You say, if we say that it's really Arabian custom, it's really modesty we should be following, not Arabian custom, so a woman shouldn't have to cover her hair. Basically, you're talking about a difference between covering your hair or not. Why is that important? I mean, why is it that it's such a crucial difference between covering your hair or not? And this gets us back to the issue of where we get truth from, what controls us. Why is this a big deal? I asked someone, why is it a big deal whether you cover your hair or not? If you're a woman, who can tell me why this is a big deal? I'm used to teaching students, so I'm used to they have to answer my questions. You don't have to, but I'm asking you to answer my question.
Again, it comes from the interpretation of the Quranic ayah, right?
Oh, I mean, I understand that, but why do we even have this, like, he brought up this, or, I'm sorry, I brought it up interpreting what you said. I've brought up two interpretations of the rules of dress in the Sharia. The Sharia is very clear. All schools of law, Sunni and Shiite, agree that a woman, if she's around any non-mahram male, has to cover, at minimum, everything except her face and her hands. This is not disagreed on. There's lots of disagreement on other things. There's lots of disagreement on riba. There's lots of disagreement on buying things that don't exist. There's lots of disagreement on drinking alcohol. We can say there's no disagreement on the aura of a woman in public. So we've now decided we're going to question a really, really major thing that's agreed upon by Muslim jurists. Why are we questioning it? Why am I willing to do this? Just so, since we've already agreed that modesty is important, and I think we're all going to agree that if modesty is important, that in America or Western Europe, modesty would probably mean a woman wearing a long sleeve shirt, a loose kind of blouse, some kind of skirt that covers her legs, which is basically what she'd be wearing anyway if she were wearing hijab. So what we've basically done is we've removed the headscarf. We've made a huge attack on the Sharia tradition. And well, I'm asking you, why have we done it? Yeah, what normative though? Yeah, I mean, this is very interesting. I heard someone from over.
I just said
It's inconvenient.
well, I mean, to our lifestyle, just having and
So it's looking different. I mean, I'm not discounting that. By the way, I'm not trying to say it's not a big deal. I just said I don't know if I would have the courage to wear hijab if I were a woman. I hope I would have the courage. Basically, it's about this issue of custom. It's one group of people saying, our custom is this, and you have to follow our custom. If you're in our country, you have to follow our custom because we want you to be like us. In addition to which, people in your country who've decided to adopt our customs, they have to be protected. They don't have to follow the custom of their people. They are allowed to follow our custom wherever they are. They have to have that protected like it's a human right. Now, I always use this example. I think it's a great example. No one ever seems to care. In Europe, women can take their tops off at the beach. I discovered this as a young teenager, traveling with my family in Europe, and it was extremely remarkable for me. Now, American women cannot take their tops off at the beach, unless it's a nude beach. If you take your top off at a swimming pool or at a beach, it will be a big scandal, and you'll probably be arrested for public indecency. American women, are they oppressed? Does there need to be a European Council of Human Rights convened to discuss the oppression of American women and how they are being prevented from taking their tops off? Do we need to write articles about this? Does it need to be discussed at length in the international press? What do you think? No. Yeah? You think so? I mean, it's very interesting to me that some things, some pieces of clothing are very important, and differences in dress are really, really important. Some are not. Even though the ones that the top issue is actually probably more controversial. So the whole point of my long answer to this question, which I learned from in talking, is that it comes down to a simple matter of one culture that has no moral reason for saying that covering your hair is good or not. It's simply a matter of culture, like whether green is nice or blue is nice. It's put so much pressure on Muslims, both in residents of Western countries and Muslims in Muslim countries, put so much pressure on them that they are willing to make a really deep stab into the Sharia tradition, simply to allow women to not cover their hair. I think that's very interesting. I'm a professor, and I don't like making normative statements, so I won't make one now. I think this is a very interesting thing to study.
Good contrast to major criticisms against the Prophet ﷺ, pre-modern and modern and postmodern.
That's a huge question. I mean,
In light of your lecture.
Okay, let me first. There's a sister who had a question, or no? No sisters did. Let's see if you had a question. Yes. Yeah.
Yes, I guess it kind of follows up a little bit on that. If we are talking of the principles behind the hadith, which would make sense, that these things were said and mentioned for a particular reason, and if the reason at the time was that you were attracting more attention, for example, because it was accustomed to wear the dress in that area, you should try and minimize that attention. Now, to the contrary, in the current culture, you are attracting more attention now by doing this than by not doing this. So then the question then that follows, I think, is do we need to interpret some of these hadiths in view of how things have changed and keep changing? Perhaps 100 years from now, it might change back to what it was.
I mean, I understand that. Yes. Well, so are you saying we should interpret hadiths in light of the change?
No, I'm just asking the question. That
Yeah.
should hadith then be interpreted at different times using the fact that they were said and all these principles are based on a deeper reason than just the physical aspect of it, or our understanding of the physical aspect.
I mean, I would say that, I don't think that the reason behind modesty rules is not attracting attention. Because, I mean, that's like saying that, praying attracts attention, so you shouldn't pray. Or, men having beards attracts attention, so men shouldn't have beards. Or men having any facial hair whatsoever attracts attention, so men shouldn't have any facial hair. I mean, it puts any number of dress or physical appearances or even actions at basically at the mercy of other people's perceptions. And that doesn't, perception in Islamic law has some power. Like you're not allowed to wear what's called sha'ar fisq. You can't wear something that is like seen as a sign of sinful behavior in your society or of another religion. So let's just say in America, all Christians wore green pants. Muslims would not be able to wear green pants then, because if they're doing this, it would be like they're dressing like a Christian. In American society, men wearing eyeliner is considered either like kind of gothic or vampire-like or Keith Richards or something like that. And one could make the argument that these things, I'm not making that argument, one could make the argument that these things are negative, and so therefore men should not wear kahl, which otherwise they would be allowed to wear as Muslims. So perception is important, but when it comes to saying something attracts attention, so we need to change major Sharia requirements, that strikes me as pushing the argument. Yes?
Covering of hair is recommended in all the three great traditions in the scriptures of Bible, Torah, and Islam. And then covering of hair is considered as part of Sabbath for babies. That's why we always see married properly covered. Nuns, they are properly covered. And in Torah, it is said that if a woman uncovers her head, it's better that her head should be shaved off. It is in Torah. So all the three great traditions, they represent the covering of babies' head. And it is also in Islam a part of Sabbath. A woman cannot offer salah without covering her head because it's included in Sabbath.
Yes, thank you. Okay, I'll not answer Dr. Kazi's question because he invited me, so I at least owe him answering his question, even though he's asked a gigantic question. So his question was, can you compare criticisms of the Prophet from the pre-modern and the modern period? It's very interesting that if you look at the way that the enemies of the Prophet, critics of Islam, opponents of Islam, attack the Prophet, from the time of Islam, the beginning of Islam until today, it's all the same things, over and over and over again. If we look, the earliest critics of the Prophet were the Quraysh, and we have some of their criticisms are noted in the Quran. And then we have the earliest Christian or non-Muslim critics like John of Damascus, who died 749, his student Theodore Abul Qurra. And after, basically their criticisms were then just parroted constantly for about 1,300 years. What are the criticisms? The Prophet is considered to be, the Prophet is violent. He's considered to be a warmonger who brings religion of the sword. That's one thing. He's considered violent. He's considered to be a charlatan, an imposter. And again, we have this in the Quran. The Quraysh are essentially saying that the Prophet is not really a prophet. The Christian tradition and the enemy opponents of Islam from outside of the Islamic tradition constantly say the Prophet is an imposter who's making up Islam from a combination of Judaism and Christianity. So violent is an imposter, and the third big pillar in criticism of the Prophet is criticizing his sexual life. This is really the big thing. And this is what we see in the Quran. In the Quran, the Surah Ahzab, I'm pretty sure it's Surah Ahzab, Surah 33, has extensive discussion of the issue of Zayd and Zaynab. I mean, there's only two people who are mentioned by name in the Quran aside from the Prophet. One of them is Zayd, and one of them is Abu Lahab. Zayd is this is amazing. This issue was so controversial that it gets brought up in the Quran like this. The Prophet, we know the story. The Prophet had an adopted son named Zayd ibn al-Haritha. So Zayd marries a woman named Zaynab, who's very beautiful, from the family of Jahsh. And their marriage is not going well. The problem is that she really loves the Prophet. And the Prophet initially counsels them to stay together, eventually clear that they're not going to be able to stay together, so he says, okay, get divorced. They get divorced. He then marries Zaynab. Now, this is extremely controversial. Extremely controversial, and I'll tell you why. Because in the Near East, whether it's Rome or Hebrew law or Mesopotamian law or Arabian custom, an adopted child is like your actual child. When Augustus Caesar, first Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, then Augustus, later known as Augustus, when he started his war against people like Brutus and Cassius and Cato, his cause was that they had murdered his father. His father, by the way, who adopted him, wasn't his actual father, and only adopted him in his will after he was dead. But still, he was his actual father. And when you have an adopted child, that child is like your actual child. So, in Hebrew law, in Arabian custom, you cannot marry, a father cannot marry the divorced wife of his son. And a son cannot marry the divorced wife of his father. This is like incest. And just, honestly, I've never really thought about this, but it doesn't really strike me as so horrible. When you say like marrying your sister, oh, that's wrong. Marrying your daughter, oh, that's messed up. Someone says a divorced wife of your father or your child, I'm not getting any strong reaction. It doesn't really do, But this caused a huge, strong reaction in the audience, the Prophet's community in Medina. So this is a great example of how custom changes, is so different in different places. It was really like the equivalent of someone marrying like a 12-year-old girl today. So really, that was that disgusting to people. And it was very controversial. The Prophet came under a lot of criticism. What does the Quran say? The Quran uses it as an instance to teach people about the real nature of adoption. To say, your adopted children are not your children. You can adopt them and take care of them, that's great, but they're never going to be your genetic children. They're never going to have that relationship to you that causes you to cringe when you think about marrying them or something, or marrying their widow, or their divorced wife. So the Quran instructs the Muslims. So this is very interesting. So the sex life of the Prophet becomes, even in his own lifetime, object of criticism. And the Zainab affair, throughout, if you were to try and count the number of times that first Arab, then Christian and Jewish Near Eastern, then later Western Christian, then later American and European, the number of times that they bring up the Zainab affair to accuse the Prophet of being lustful, of being so enslaved by desire that he actually used his fake religion to justify his marriage to Zainab. You would not be able to count all the times. It's just so, it comes up so often. Now, what's very interesting is that nobody ever talks about his marriage to Aisha. They criticize the Prophet for marrying Aisha, but they criticize him because he had a dream of her before he married her, and she appeared to him sort of finely adorned in clothing, and they say, look, he had this dream and he was so seized by desire that he had to marry her. So this is just another example of him being kind of a slave to his desires. This is how it's brought up in Western criticisms and Christian and Jewish criticisms of the Prophet. And I've read a lot of criticisms of the Prophet throughout the medieval and modern period. No one ever talks about Aisha's age. No one ever talks about Aisha's age. Why do they never talk about Aisha's age? Because nobody cares. Because in the pre-industrial world, and in many parts of the world today, women get married as soon as they're able to get married. As soon as you're physically able. Why? Because there's nothing else to do. What else are you going to do? Go to school? Go to high school? Go to medical school? It's a peasant tilling a field in southern France in the year 1200 is not going to do a PhD in neuroscience. Once they are physically able to have children, they get married and they have children. That's what people do. Especially since their lifespan is probably 40 or 45 years anyway, their life expectancy, so they better get busy because they're not going to live very long. It's only the first instance I've seen of someone criticizing the Prophet for marrying Aisha when she was 9 is in 1905, a book by a British Orientalist named David Margoliouth. It's the first time he says this, that I've seen anyone mention this. And now it's become very standard criticism of the Prophet to say that he's a pedophile, or just to use this as an example of how he's a morally flawed person. But what I find very interesting is, if you mention this to somebody, you go out onto the street and you say to random, you pretend you're a reporter and do an interview on the street, and you ask somebody, what's worse? Or I'm going to tell you two stories. Which one is more shocking? A guy, hacked his wife to death with a butcher's knife. I heard that happen. A man married a 9-year-old girl. 53-year-old man married a 9-year-old girl. Person would say, oh, that's terrible. Oh, that's messed up. But the funny thing is that I'd say many more societies consider stabbing your wife to death. Many more societies consider that to be wrong than societies that consider, one, a girl marrying when she's able to have children, and any age disparity between the couple, consider that to be wrong. Many more societies consider murdering your spouse to be wrong than consider marrying a young girl or age difference in a marriage to be wrong. This is the reaction people have to these two stories is actually inversely proportional to the extent to which these things are actually recognized as wrong globally and throughout history. That I find very interesting. Does everyone understand that? I know that wasn't as clear an explanation as possible. What I'm trying to say is people's reactions, the kind of gut reaction they have to these two stories, is inversely proportional to the actual global agreement on whether those things are right or wrong, which I find fascinating. Yes. By the way, just tell me when I have to be quiet. I'll just shut up. Yes.
The other day I was reading that Imam Bukhari has a collection of 600,000 hadith. And he went through them and finally selected somewhere between 6,000 to 7,000. So are you concerned that he may have left out some authentic hadith from his collection?
Yeah, this is something that Muslim scholars have talked a lot about from actually the time of Imam Bukhari. His first reaction to his Sahih was actually criticism. People were criticizing him. Sunnis were criticizing him because they thought that he was basically going to give the enemies of the Sunnis, he was going to give them a way to dismiss all the other hadiths because they would say, so you only these are authentic. And the other ones you want to use are not, so you can't use these in debates. But a number of scholars immediately after him compiled collections of hadiths that they said were also sahih. So there's, in general, in Sunni Islam, there's no real concern that only the hadiths of Bukhari and Muslim are authentic. Any number of other hadiths can be authentic too, but that depends on certain scholars considering them to be authentic. They don't enjoy the prestige of Bukhari and Muslim's stamp of approval, and they also don't enjoy the consensus around the value of Bukhari and Muslim's accomplishments. But there's all sorts of other hadiths that are considered authentic by Muslim scholars. Yes?
How can we be sure that the hadith are the actual utterings of the Prophet?
You can't. If you want to talk in terms of epistemological certainty, which, by the way, Muslim scholars are very happy to do. If you want to talk about 100%, bet your life, trust, exercise, fall backwards type certainty, which I guess isn't actually that certain considering people do it on weird corporate retreats. But the point is that if you want to talk about real betting your life certainty, you can't be. And by the way, no Muslim scholar would say you can. Even Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, he was asked, a hadith you consider authentic, sahih. He says, I'll act on it. I'll use it to determine law, but I won't swear, like in court. I won't swear that the Prophet said it. Why is this? You might be shocked by what I'm saying. Because one, they'd have a couple of different, look in Bukhari's Sahih, and a hadith might appear 2 or 3 times, like that hadith of the rib. Could appear 2 or 3 times with different wording. Which one did the Prophet say? Either he said this one or he said that one. Which one are his actual words? Which one are you going to swear to God or by your life are his actual words? It's pretty clear he said something like along these lines. We have the gist. And maybe he said it twice and 2 different companions heard it on different occasions. Maybe he said it and 2 different people heard it and remembered it slightly differently. Maybe one person heard it in one way, but then as it was transmitted, kind of like a game of telephone, there was a little bit of changes introduced. So Muslim scholars weren't naive. I mean, people think that somehow hadith is this science where the words are just preserved 100%. That's not the case. No one ever says that. No Muslim scholar ever says that.
Why can't the same criticism be applied to the Quran, considering it's an oral tradition?
You have different ahruf. You have different, sometimes it's, in the Morocco they say, Maliki Yawmiddin. Maliki, the king of the day of judgment. In the rest of, in most of the rest of the Muslim world, they say Maliki Yawmiddin, the owner, master of the day of judgment. Malik, 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 two different words. Now, to answer your question about I can't remember what your question was, but it made sense to me at the time, and I'll continue with what I think you asked, which is, they didn't say you could be 100% sure. There's no way that you get the same level of certainty as the Quran, except maybe on a few hadiths, very few number, like the hadith that says, whoever lies about me intentionally, whoever misrepresents me intentionally, let him prepare for himself a seat in hellfire. This is transmitted so widely, nobody can question that the Prophet said that general thing. But even in these different transmissions, there's differences. In one version, it says, whoever misrepresents me, no mention of intention. Let him prepare for himself a seat in hellfire. Most of the versions say, whoever misrepresents me intentionally, let him prepare for himself a hadith in hellfire. I won't get into it, but there's a big difference between those two versions. So they would never say, I'm 100% sure the Prophet said this. What they would say is, I'm sure enough that I'm going to actually base my behavior on it, and I'm very sure that he said something general gist of this statement, even though the details I'm not quite sure about. Yes, in the back, sorry.
I just have a question. What would you compare Sharia law to? More similar to common law or civil law, more codified? And the second part to that is, how can you implement Sharia in modern law today?
Those are complicated questions. The question was, what would you compare the Sharia law to common law or civil law? For people who don't know, and I'm not a lawyer, I'll try and explain it. So common law is basically something that comes out of the British English tradition, and it develops over centuries and centuries and centuries. It's British legal custom, social custom, the king's rulings, the king's royal exchequer's rulings, and then gets kind of written about and codified in the 1600s, 1700s, and then actually has a big influence on the United States as well. So we have basically a common law tradition with constitutional law and other kind of law added on top of that. And it's based on, mostly on precedent. So you have rulings in the past, which then govern your rulings in the present. If a judge decides something, that becomes precedent, and I can use that judge's decision to say, you judge should acknowledge the law as being this way. Or we can derive principles from all of these judges' rulings and then use this principle to rule on an issue in a certain way. Civil law basically emerges from the Napoleonic law codes of the early 1800s, where it's like more scientific. Let's just sit down and come up with a ruling for everything. The ruling for murder is this. The ruling for stealing is that. The ruling for when you run over a guy's toe with your car is this. The ruling when you run over his whole leg is that. That's it. So what does a judge do? He just sits there. What's the case? Okay, go to the book. Here's the ruling. That's it. The Sharia is, as it's applied in courts, it's interesting. I mean, in theory, it's more similar to the civil law tradition because precedent doesn't have any meaning. I mean, it doesn't really matter what another Sharia court judge did, because his ruling is, in theory, just him going and getting the ruling of the Maliki school of law and applying it, right? In theory, a Sharia court judge, and it depends really on place and time. We're talking about 1,400 years from Senegal to Indonesia. It's a big difference, or a great deal of diversity. But in theory, if he's a Maliki judge, he follows Maliki ruling. But also you have many times and places where the judge would be free to pick different opinions from within that school of law to pick different opinions from other schools of law based on what he felt was the most equitable for the situation, what was going to be the most just result for the litigants. In that case, it's not like civil law because he's not just going to, here's the ruling and I have to give it to you. It's more like a common law tradition because he's thinking about all these different principles and options and he's trying to figure out which one to apply. But his ruling doesn't have any precedent, won't carry precedent for other judges. Now, precedent does have some weight in the Islamic tradition. It comes out rarely, but it's very interesting. Like, if you say if you point to God, you say God is above us. I have a question. Is God above us? This is a huge argument. But, I mean, some people say that's really kufr to say this. Many Asharis would say this because you're saying God is in a body. If he's up there, it means he's not over there, which means he's in a body, which means God has a body, which means God's limited, which is all anthropomorphic and unacceptable. But they would also acknowledge that the early Muslims pointed up when they talked about God. And they weren't kafirs. No one declared them kafirs. So therefore, doing this cannot be kufr. So it's an instance when, even though their thinking on Sharia issues takes them to one answer, precedent says that answer can't be correct. Yes, Imam.
I appreciate everything that I've heard so far. My question is, what kind of safeguards do you put in place when we have these kind of discussions that present a kind of flexible approach to interpreting hadith when laymen may walk away assuming that they have that ability individually?
I mean, I'm not a mufti, but I would say what I would tell people is that, Islam is not some kind of cult. Okay, I mean, Islam is a religion based on proof. It's based on evidence and conviction. We follow the Quran because the Quran is historically intact, because God constantly tells us over and over again in the Quran. Were you my student? Were you ever in my class? No, before you, in front of you. You, yeah. You look just like one of my students. I don't think he liked me very much, but I'm glad you're not him. The Quran says, "La taqfu ma laysa laka bihi ilmun." Don't follow what you have no knowledge of. The mistake that other communities always make is they start taking their speculations and their whims and their desires and they think this is truth. The Quran says, follow truth, haqq. So if somebody comes to you and says, I think you should do this, I think you should do that, you tell them, no, I don't take my knowledge about God and about worship and right and wrong from any source but God. If somebody comes up to you, Muslims are not, if you deny a hadith, even a hadith in Sahih Bukhari, if you deny that hadith, as far as I know, whether it's Ash'aris or Salafis or anybody, no one's going to say you're a kafir. They might say you're a heretic, they might say you're a sinner, they might say you're going astray, but you can't say they're not Muslim because they haven't denied anything that is epistemologically 100% true. If they say, I don't believe in the Quran, yeah, okay, they're not Muslim anymore. Say, I don't believe in this verse, I don't believe this verse is part of the Quran, okay, you're not Muslim anymore. There's all sorts of things you can do to not be Muslim. But saying, I don't believe that particular hadith, that's not going to make you not Muslim. So the reason I'm saying this is because we have to understand that when you're Muslim, it doesn't mean you're signing up for some cult where anytime somebody comes and tells you Islam says this, you have to agree with them. Or anytime someone comes up and shoves a hadith in your face, you have to submit to them and say, okay, I'll follow you. You do exactly what the early hadith scholars did, I think. This is what I would say. The first thing, if somebody came and gave Ahmad ibn Hanbal or Imam al-Bukhari, if they gave him a hadith, they said, the Prophet says this. They'd say, Min ayna hadha? Where is this from? The first principle of hadith criticism. Al-isnad min ad-din, lawla al-isnad laqal man yasha' ma yasha'. If the isnad is part of the religion. If it weren't for the isnad, whoever wanted would say whatever they want. So if you can't give me some kind of source for this, I'm not going to listen to you. Just right away, I won't listen to you. So you say this hadith is in Sahih al-Bukhari. Someone comes up to you and he gives you a hadith. It strikes you as weird, doesn't make sense to you, it doesn't seem correct as a Muslim. You say, where is this from? They don't have an answer. You tell them, okay, buzz off, politely. If they say this is in Sahih al-Bukhari, and let's say you're feeling trustworthy, so you believe them, even though in theory as a Muslim scholar you shouldn't believe them, you should actually go and check to verify, because people always make this claim and it tends not to be true a lot of the time. Let's say it actually is in Sahih al-Bukhari. I think what people should do is to do exactly what Muslim scholars did, which is to say, this strikes me as odd. I find it problematic based on what I think Islam says, based on what I think God's teachings are. But I recognize that the God and the Prophet are more knowledgeable. So I'm going to ask other people's opinions. I'm going to ask scholars. I'm going to read about this. I'm going to see someone who's more knowledgeable and see if they can explain this to me. Like I should have done about the rib hadith instead of sitting around and waiting until I caught an HBO special, which made me realize that this was actually not controversial at all. So does that answer your question? And is that a helpful answer or not?
I think so. I think my only reason for bringing it up is because that particular hadith that you mentioned about the rib and how you came to the conclusion, you may open the door for a layman to do that with any hadith. You know,
Yeah.
You yourself are, a scholar of hadith.
Well, I'm not a very good example to follow in life in general. But I mean, I would say that, first, to recap my answer, Islam is not a cult. You have to have evidence for the things you believe. And if you say, what's your evidence to somebody, you are being very Muslim. And hatul burhan in kuntum min as-sadiqin. Bring your proof if you are amongst those who tell the truth. This is a principle we know from the Quran. If they bring the proof, and this is considered to be reliable hadith by Muslim scholars, then ask someone who's more knowledgeable to explain it to you. Chances are your doubts will be alleviated. What I would not do is what I think a lot of Muslims do, which is to really be arrogant and to take truth from the world around them, the culture around them, which, by the way, we can sit and criticize till we're blue in the face for all its problems, and to somehow take this and assume that it is the measure to which prophetic wisdom must reach.